Developed by Gruber Entertainment and published by SuperGG.com, Deadlink is a cyberpunk first-person shooter roguelite, featuring bombastic combat, bass-heavy electronic tunes, and a slick, neon-drenched art style. The easiest way to describe it is if you took Doom Eternal and merged it with a roguelite such as Hades. And if that sounds like a tasty combo to you, then you're gonna want to tune in for this one. In today's video, I'll be lending my thoughts on Deadlink and whether or not it should be living on your SSD. So let's slot some implants and let this simulation begin.
Try not to get hurt out there. You're the best of the best. Remember that.
Deadlink is set in the far, far cyberpunk future, where crime is rampant, spider tanks roam the streets, corporations battle for supremacy, and the line between humans and machines is becoming more and more blurred. You play as a nameless soldier who has been recruited by the Corporate Security Agency, or CSA, to take part in the top-secret Deadlink project. Your mission? Pilot the autonomous robots known as combat shells to stop the nefarious deeds of cybernetic gangs and greedy militant corporations. Basically, you pilot the shells remotely, guiding them through procedurally generated areas, fighting off goons, and upgrading as you go. If your shell is destroyed, obviously no harm comes to you. However, you'll have to learn from your mistakes and reattempt everything from the beginning, with the option to improve your shell in between each run. It's a story that leans hard into common cyberpunk tropes and will feel very familiar to fans of the genre, although it is a clever setup for a roguelite, and the narrative is efficiently conveyed through dialogue from your support team, either at the base of operations or during gameplay, who are a charismatic bunch, well written and voiced.
Metamaterial particulate was once just a gadget for creating psychedelic party tricks. Cartel assassins quickly learned to use it as optical camouflage. Spoiled the fun.
If the story does interest you, there is a decent amount of lore fleshing everything out, most of which can be read up in a codex. It's a solid premise all around. However, while that's nice to have, first-person shooters, and roguelites especially, are all about that gameplay, and in this regard, Deadlink really delivers. There are 4 classes, or combat shells, to play as in Deadlink, each with their own unique qualities and abilities. The soldier revolves around balanced combat and maneuverability, whereas the juggernaut is the heavy powerhouse, smashing all in his path. They are equipped with a shotgun and double-barrel shotgun respectively. The magnum-equipped hunter and rifle-wielding engineer lean more toward specialized tactics, with the hunter using stealth and trickery, and the engineer hacking and mechanisms. We'll touch more on what makes these shells distinct as we go, but for now let's keep the focus on the basics. Each shell is equipped with just 2 weapons, a primary exclusive to them, and a heavy type that can be swapped out during a run. These consist of rocket launchers, remote mine launchers, energy weapons, and special elemental variants. All shells have a rechargeable dash for defense and maneuvering, a simple melee punch, as well as a grenade, and depending on their weapons and abilities, additional means of traversal. Mechanically, it all feels very similar to Doom Eternal, albeit a more concentrated version of it. I should also say there were times where the feel reminded me of a few of the characters from Overwatch. I think the similar art style contributes to that. In all, I have to say that these are some of the tightest, well-oiled FPS mechanics I've experienced this year. The shooting is just superb, snappy, and punchy with a lot of great damage feedback from enemies. Most of the weapons were enjoyable to use, although some of the heavy types took a little bit to get used to, like the delayed fire of the particle accelerator that shoots a piercing laser. When I got the hang of it though, I did find it to be a hoot, although not as much as the good old-fashioned shells, bullets, and rockets. Movement is ninja quick and responsive, affording some beautiful precision, which is good because combat is intense and goes at a breakneck speed. Enemies just fling themselves at you, and while aggressive offense is important, defensive maneuvering about the arena is key. And in Deadlink, this is effortless, assuming you don't get too surrounded. And punctuating the end of a fight with a slow-mo flurry of collectibles coming at you is the type of satisfying that keeps you playing for just one more room. Each run is made up of 4 distinct areas, each featuring around 6 to 9 rooms, with the final room dedicated to a boss fight. Each room is, you guessed it, a combat challenge where the goal is to defeat all enemies to progress, although sometimes it throws a different challenge at you, like surviving an onslaught for 30 seconds. When a room is cleared, the player typically has a choice of 3 exits, each granting a different reward. These rewards can be as simple as experience points or cash, or something a little more consequential, like weapon mods and upgrades for your shell, although sometimes the exits lead to optional mini-boss challenges. And in between rooms, there's a chance to encounter vendors where you can gain additional buffs, or disadvantages if unlucky.
Hard to come by the good stuff these days.
Bosses in Deadlink are excellent and really highlight the differences of each shell, as each of them have distinct strengths and weaknesses against them. All the bosses are multi-stage battles that chuck in normal enemies to really test the player. Each one got my heart pounding. What can be a little frustrating about the bosses though is that most of them have one attack phase where they just throw everything at you and try to overwhelm you, and you have to defeat these phases as fast as humanly possible or else die. It can be a little irritating when you're still going through trial and error with them, but it also contributes to the sense of reward and progression in figuring these baddies out and wiping them out in a matter of minutes. So them's the basics. Now let's get into what makes Deadlink really shine, starting with the device at the center of the game, the marking system. Each shell is able to mark enemies, marking being them highlighted in bright cyber graphics, and when a marked enemy is defeated, they drop shield and ammo pickups. Keep in mind, there aren't any health pickups past end room rewards, and this is the only way to replenish your shield besides temporary shield boosts. So this is a key mechanic for keeping yourself alive, and much of Deadlink's gameplay revolves around it. All shells can mark by grenades, but past that they have differing styles of marking by use of their abilities. So for example, let's look at the Soldier. Soldier has a grapple hook that when latched onto enemies, marks them. Soldier also has the Scrambler, which shoots a narrow shockwave, marking all in its path. It's a marking style geared towards singular enemies and close quarters combat. The Engineer, however, is the polar opposite. Engineer has a device called the Worm Link that will mark an enemy when attached to them. If that enemy is killed while the Worm Link is attached, it will send out a spherical shockwave that will mark all in its vicinity. Engineer also has a remote turret, which, yes, shoots enemies, but will mark anyone in its deployment radius. So where the Soldier excels at marking individuals in close quarters combat, the Engineer is all about marking in groups and keeping distance. And the other shell's marking styles is a combination of singular and group marking. This, next to their weapons, is the biggest thing that distinguishes each shell's playstyle. What makes all this even cooler is how these gameplay systems can be upgraded and connected to each other to bring cascades of hurt on your foes. Each run, the player can earn implants, essentially buffs, that can be installed into 4 slots representing each shell's mechanics: the weapon swap, the shell's 2 unique abilities, and C-ball breaks. C-balls are the floating green cylinders that can be grappled onto and broken open for heavy weapon ammo. Each implant features active and passive buffs, although some are solely passive. The passives are ever present, like 10% more damage against armored enemies or faster reloading for one of your weapons. But the active buffs only trigger on use of the mechanic they're installed into. So, for example, you can install an implant where upon weapon swap, your next shot will cause fire damage or shock damage, or another that will replenish your ammo upon use of an ability, or shoot out a small homing rocket that marks an enemy. There's even ones that will give you damage boosts determined by how much money you have or how much health you've lost. However, you can't just slot the implants anywhere. Each has a power level that limits which mechanics they can be slotted into, although solely passive ones can be slotted anywhere. I can't stress this enough. There's a boatload of implants and a boatload of possibilities for your builds. And naturally, the more you play and grind, the more options you'll have. In between runs, the player can spend their rewards to unlock higher level augments, permanent buffs and perks for their combat shells, along with additional implant slots. And I think it is just so cool that the buffs are tied into using your mechanics. It makes even the smallest actions, the smallest choices, consequential. And it really lets the player feel their upgrades, feel their progression and power. When Deadlink is at its best is when you can set your implants up to complement each other and chain react. So let's say you install an implant where upon breaking a C-ball, you get a 50% damage boost for 5 seconds. Along with that, you have an implant installed into an ability, let's say one that marks enemies in groups, that when activated causes nearby C-balls to explode, triggering that 50% boost. But at the same time, you have another implant that causes marked enemies to light on fire. And maybe you have another implant that boosts fire damage by 30%. What I'm getting at here is that you can set it up to cause layer upon layer upon layer of hurt on your enemies with just a few keystrokes. And it is awesome. There is impressive and unexpected depth here. Play your cards right, or rather your implants, and you might be able to clear a room in a matter of seconds. And the feeling of that is akin to a samurai whipping out their sword and then immediately sheathing it as their enemies drop around them. There are other aspects that contribute to this feeling and affect your runs, like the stacking weapon mods, elemental damage types, and shell upgrades, but I'll leave those to you to discover for yourselves. At the end of the day, the marking system and implants are the heart of all of this, and what will keep you coming back. While initially Deadlink can be a tough game, you will eventually hit that point, quicker than you might expect, where you've purchased most of the upgrades and can utterly bulldoze through a run. Fortunately, there are the harder difficulties, called crisis levels, that unlock after your first completed run. The harder crisis levels essentially buff enemy stats, throw more of them at you, but also boost rewards. And you'll feel that extra spice upon entering the first room and seeing that all the starting enemies have shields, along with the more energetic attack patterns of bosses. The harder crisis levels is where I think this game really shines, because here your build choices are imperative. I found myself getting destroyed on my early runs because I was either underpowered or off balance with my upgrades. As much as I like the implant system, if I did have one critique of it, it does favor the player a little too much. Negative passive effects are fairly uncommon and not all that severe. And on the harder crisis levels, there's a greater sense of trade-off and consequence in what you implant. And a big part of what makes roguelites fun for me is dealing with the pros and cons of whatever build you're stuck with. What's a bummer though is that not much new is introduced in the harder difficulties. Oh sure, there's new weapons and access to more implants, not to mention story revelations, but past that it's the same stuff from the first crisis level, just tougher. And I wish the devs took the opportunity to introduce some new or remixed enemy types, new challenges, and bosses as well. Adding to that is the fact that Deadlink doesn't have the visual surprise and randomness of other roguelites. Much of what makes each run feel different is the mechanics and feel of your shell. Otherwise, most of the arenas, enemies, and weapon types will be seen and experienced after completing the first crisis level. And while this never fully diminishes the fun of the game, things definitely start feeling repetitive and a little boring when you start hitting that 20 to 30 hour range. To be clear, this is not me saying Deadlink doesn't have enough content. No, for the $25 price tag, what's here is stellar. What I'm saying, to put it crudely, is that the game blows its load in the first crisis level. So much so that I wish some of the things introduced in Crisis Level 1 were saved for the harder ones. However, this only opens the door for expansion, and Deadlink is certainly a game begging for DLC. I see plenty of room to add and grow, whether it's new shells, new bosses, implants, or arenas. The foundation of this game is strong and absolutely fertile, and I am eager to see how it's supported in the future.
I am the reason why Phoenix PNC is the best in the business.
The last thing we'll cover is Deadlink's visual and audio presentation, which honestly I have few complaints about. Deadlink presents a vibrant cyberpunk art style with a stylish anime slant to it. Classics like Akira and Ghost in the Shell especially come across as key influences. The colors and lighting are superb and really bring some artistic flair and character. The textures, while simple, have a subtle handbrush look to them, which gives everything some nice texture, with the attractive reflections giving it all a nice finish. It is modest in the amount of polygons it pushes. Enemies might come off simplistic when looked at too closely, but the blockier sculpting complements the animated style and perhaps helps keep the frame rate stable. The animations are smooth and springy, once again reminding me of titles like Overwatch, but they're very polished and show off some wonderful detail. I was especially impressed when the spider tank lifted its legs to go through this narrow area. That seems like a small thing, but I really appreciate details like that. If I had to pull out some nitpicks, I suppose the latter areas, the beige labs and dark warehouses, don't look quite as interesting as the first, a cyberpunk red light district full of moody, warm lighting and brothels, although the latter areas are still visually captivating in their own right. And sometimes the amount of particle effects on screen can make for some confusion, but honestly, the better you get at the game, the less this is a problem. What can I say? It's polished, beautiful, it runs like a dream, and it even supports DLSS. As for the music, look, I'm gonna level with you. In first-person shooters, I am a sucker for infectious beats and thunderous power chords, and this game is a treat of the former. My office sounded like a rave in the middle of a Vegas gun range, and for me, that's the ideal sound bed for some technical, high-intensity first-person shooting. Apologies to my neighbors. And I have to say, it's great stuff for cutting montages. Deadlink is an outstanding shooter and a solid roguelite with some room to grow. If you're a fan of Doom Eternal and/or roguelites like Hades, then I would say absolutely check this out. Like I said, these are some of the best FPS mechanics I've experienced this year, and the rogue progression has that hook that will keep you good and addicted, even when things start getting a little too familiar. But that's it for me today. What are your thoughts on Deadlink? Be sure to let me know down in the comments. If you dug the video, please be sure to subscribe, like, share, and smack that bell. If you want to come say hi, my Discord is linked below, along with my affiliate links. I'm Kirk, and thank you for watching this video. Stay safe out there.